This is lecture number 18 for Wednesday, May 20th for the French Revolution class at Northland College. Last time I talked about Napoleonic France and how Napoleon became the Emperor of France and how he instituted this sort of police state and a centralized, very efficient government. Today I want to talk about what happens outside of France, because ultimately what undoes Napoleon is not his own people, it's the resistance of everybody else in Europe. And so you recall that Napoleon has been a brilliant general, right? Remember, he conquered all of Italy all by himself without reinforcements, and he had led successful campaigns elsewhere in Europe. He was really quite good, and so it looked at. I mean, Napoleon's rise and fall really rests upon the fact that he's absolutely a brilliant general, which allows him to conquer lots of nations as long as they're not united against him. But he would ultimately be undone by military defeat. So Napoleon comes to power in 1799. You recall that he staged his coup, the 18th Brumaire coup, in part because the Directory was struggling. The Austrians had reinvaded Italy. The Directory was struggling, facing all sorts of pushback. And so Napoleon, once he becomes first consul, really has to immediately deal with the fact that the Austrians are invading Italy. And so between 1799 and 1802, he would go into Italy, lead another army into Italy, and he would really crush the Austrians in Italy. Again, he really just mops it up. And he forces the Austrians to sign another treaty, this time at Luneville in 1801. And he reestablishes all the little kingdoms in Italy that he had done before, the little republics. And essentially, this leads to 14 months of calm and peace because the Austrians are defeated and nobody else is willing to take on Napoleon at that moment. But England realizes that they really don't want Napoleon dominating Europe. The system for a long time had been established, in the mid-1600s, at the end of the wars of religion, the Protestant Catholic wars during the Reformation. The Treaty of Westphalia had set up a sort of a system of different nations that none could really dominate. And that system had now broken down, essentially, because Napoleon was destroying the system. And so the British decided that they really had to come up with a way of stopping Napoleon. They realized that on their own, the British really didn't have the manpower, the armies to confront Napoleon, especially since they would have to do it on the continent. And so the British put together a coalition of nations. And essentially this wasn't that hard to do because the British could basically say, Napoleon made himself king, but he's installing the revolution. He's destroying aristocratic privilege. He's destroying the whole aristocratic order everywhere he goes, and so we need to stop him. And the old aristocratic states, the monarchies, were happy to try to stop him. And so the coalition included, the Holy Roman Emperor, which is really Austria, Hungary, and then Prussia and Russia and Spain gets involved. And so basically in 1804, you get this coalition formed, and Napoleon has to go out and fight them again. He basically, in 1805, he invades Germany to fight the Austrians. Germany, what we call Germany at this point, is really not a country. There's Prussia, which is the northern part of Germany, which is an independent kingdom. But Austria dominates most of what we would today call southern Germany. Okay, so he invades Germany. He wins decisive, or he basically crushes the Austrians, and he forces them to sign a peace treaty in 1805, where he takes a whole bunch of territory from Austria. And in particular, and from Prussia, in particular, he makes his brother, Joseph Bonaparte, the king of Italy. So at this point, Napoleon is now an emperor. He's in favor of monarchy now, so he's not setting up republics in Italy anymore. He's decided he's just going to put his family everywhere. So he takes Italy from Austria, and he makes his brother, Joseph Bonaparte, the king of Italy. And then he takes Holland from the Austrians, and he creates his brother, Louis Bonaparte, as the king of Holland. He officially dismantles the Holy Roman Empire, Now the Kingdom of Austria and Hungary, etc., are still there. And the one downer in all of this is that in 1805, Napoleon's fleet gets destroyed at Trafalgar off the coast of Spain. And not only the French fleet, but the French fleet gets destroyed by Admiral Nelson, who had destroyed the French fleet of the Army of the Nile, or the Battle of the Nile also. So this means that Napoleon really is hampered in his fighting against England, because England is this island, he can't get at it, right? And so England has this fortress, so as long as England's navy is intact and France's navy is kind of beaten up, he can't do anything about it. But Napoleon goes on to fight the Prussians, etc. And he in 1806-07 he defeats Prussia and Russia, and forces them to sign the Peace of Tilsit in 1807. And in this, Prussia loses a bunch of territory. So basically, Prussia had been a pretty big kingdom that included a big chunk of Germany. They lose a lot of that territory, and Napoleon creates a new kingdom out of that territory, that chunk of Germany, and he gives it to his brother Jerome, and calls it the Kingdom of Westphalia. So his brother Jerome is the king of Westphalia. So he's got Joseph, who's the king. His brother Joseph is the king of Italy. His brother Louis is the king of Holland, and his brother Jerome is the king of Westphalia. In 1807, Napoleon invades Spain, which is part of the coalition, and he crushes the Spanish and drives the Spanish monarchy out, and puts his brother, of course, Joseph, as king of Spain. Okay, now you might say, well, isn't Joseph the king of Italy? Well, yes, he is. So now he's the king of Italy and the king of Spain. At this point, really, and he forces Austria and Prussia and Russia to all basically sign peace treaties with him, meaning they become allies. And so England its coalition has fallen apart, because all the nations that had lined up as England's allies against France had now been defeated by Napoleon, and they've either been carved up and handed out to Napoleon's brothers, or they've signed peace treaties saying that they will not fight Napoleon anymore. And so at this point, Napoleon really controls Europe. I mean, he controls the entire continent. England is the only nation he's still at war with, and England really doesn't have the kind of army that could go invade Europe, given how big Napoleon's armies are. And so England basically, they just settle down to fighting on the seas with their navies. So their navies start fighting each other. Incidentally, this is where you start to get the Aubrey Maturin novels, the movie Master and Commander starring Russell Crowe. It's set in the British Navy during this time period, just in case you're wondering. In 1809, the Austrians would revolt, and Napoleon would go and invade Austria and crush them again. And so it really looks like nothing can stop Napoleon, right? That he just wins and wins and wins, and nobody can stop him, nobody can defeat him. He's just better than everybody else, and the French army at this point is battle tested, and he has a whole slew of generals who know exactly what he wants and how he thinks, and it's a finely tuned military machine. All that is great until 1812. In 1812, the Russians decide that they want to revolt against Napoleon's domination of Europe. And the reason they do this is partly because Napoleon had instituted this system called the Continental System, where he was trying to boycott England. But England had all these colonies all around the world, and England was a major trading nation all around the world. And to cut off England was in many ways more painful for for Europe than it was for England. And so the Russians in particular didn't like being sort of locked up with the English Navy, basically shutting down Russia's trade with the rest of the world. And so Russia really can't handle this being part of Napoleon's boycott. They want to trade with England. They want to trade with the rest of the world. And so Russia revolts in 1812. They want to break out of the treaty with Napoleon. They want to go their own way. And they're really not trying to destroy Napoleon. They just want to go their own way. But Napoleon's not going to let that happen. So in June of 1812, Napoleon leads an army. His biggest army, he has 600,000 soldiers. He leads this army into Russia. Now the Russians know that they really can't go toe-to-toe and fight with Napoleon. Nobody has beaten Napoleon yet, right? And so there's no real sense that the Russians have a great army that could defeat Napoleon. The Austrians have a better army, and they've been just getting the floor mopped with them by Napoleon. And so the Russians try a different tactic. What they basically do is they fight a few inconsequential battles with Napoleon. They don't really commit anything. They just sort of fight a few skirmishes with Napoleon. But what they do instead is they try to harass him just enough to keep him. He's moving towards Moscow. He wants to take Moscow. Okay. And so what they do is they just go ahead of him and they burn everything. They burn everything down on the way to Moscow. They burn down villages. They burn down towns. They move all the grain and livestock out of his way so he can't get it. And this is an army of 600,000 soldiers. They need to eat, right? And so what the Russians are doing is basically saying, you can march all the way across Russia. We can't stop you, but we can make sure you have nothing to eat on the way. So Napoleon marches, he started in June, he marches right across Russia. He gets to Moscow in September. He arrives in Moscow, but Moscow has been evacuated basically by the Russians. There's almost nobody there, right? And so he conquers this empty city, and the Russians are not giving up. They're saying, we're not fighting the way you think we're fighting. We're gonna starve you. And so Napoleon sits around in Moscow for a month, sort of wondering what the heck he's supposed to do. He thought taking Moscow would force the Russians to sign a peace treaty with him, but they're not, right? So finally, Napoleon realizes that he can't sit there all winter. There's no food, and winter is coming, right? This is now it's now October, November. So he decides he's got to just march right back to his territory, which his brother controls Westphalia in Germany. And so Napoleon starts marching back, but now the Russians really spring their trap, because now it's the fields are empty, all the grain has been harvested, everything is there's no food to be had on the land, and now the Russians start to actively attack Napoleon, not to have a big battle with him, but rather just they just shadow his army, and if any soldiers get too far out of the army looking for food, the Russians pounce on them and crush them, and the Russians just keep doing just enough attacks to keep Napoleon on track, and the track is the exact same path he had come in on. Napoleon had come in over the summer on a path to Moscow, and the Russians had burned everything down, and his army had eaten everything on that path on the way by. Now they have to go back on the same path, and there is no food. And anytime they stray off of that path, the Russians attack them. And now it's cold, and now it's December, right? And Russian winter has set in, and Napoleon's armies, they left in June, they are not ready for winter. And there's no food, and they start to starve. And Napoleon starts to go faster and faster, and he's trying to march as fast as he can to get out of there. But his army is starving, his army is starting to fall apart, and diseases start to ravage his soldiers. He finally gets back to Prussia, back to Germany, his brother to Westphalia, in December. But he gets back with 40,000 soldiers. Now, he left in June with 600,000 soldiers. So over 90% of his army has died on the way, most of them from cold and starvation, although a lot died from disease also. So Napoleon, he never really got to fight a big battle with the Russians. He never got to defeat them, but he winds up losing 90% of his army. He's just destroyed. Well, as soon as he gets back, everybody who had signed these peace treaties with him realizes if there's a moment to revolt against Napoleon, it's now. He just lost his main army. He just lost his 560,000 soldiers. He just lost 500,000 soldiers. Well, Napoleon immediately tries to raise a new army, and he actually does a pretty good job of raising a new army. But Prussia and Austria both revolt against him and go to war with him. And so he's got a brand new army that's not very experienced. All of his experienced, junior officers, etc., have starved to death, and the soldiers don't know what they're supposed to be doing. So he goes into a battle with a really green army, and the Austrians and the Prussians finally beat him at Leipzig in October of 1813. So almost a year later, 10 months later, Napoleon gets defeated at Leipzig. And then the Allies start attacking on all fronts. England had been sort of carrying out a guerrilla war in Spain and Portugal. They now sent a major force with General Wellington, and they invade most of Spain, and they start marching up into southern France. And the Austrians and Prussians start climbing on, and Napoleon's getting attacked there, and the Russians start sending, it's everybody's piling on, and he doesn't have the army anymore. He's taken so many heavy losses with the Russian campaign mostly, but then at Leipzig, etc., that he just can't stop them. And so by April of 1814, the Allies get to Paris, and Napoleon has to surrender. So Napoleon surrenders, and they decide, the British and the Prussians and the Austrians decide that what they're going to do with Napoleon is send him into exile. Right? They don't want to turn him into a martyr. They're worried about that. Instead, they're just going to send him in exile. So they pick this little island in the Mediterranean called Elba, and they send him to Elba. And then they reinstall the French monarchy. Right? They've now, basically, when they defeated Napoleon, they have now defeated the French Revolution, and they decide they're going to undo the French Revolution. It's 1814, but they are going to take France back to 1789. In particular, they say, well, we don't have Louis XVI anymore. He got beheaded in 1793, and Louis' son, Louis XVII, died at the age of 10 in 1795 or something like that. But Louis' brother, who used to be the Comte d'Artois, has now named himself Louis XVIII. And so the British say, okay, Louis XVIII, you're the King of France. So they bring back the Bourbon monarchy, Louis XVIII, and they put him in charge. And they send Napoleon off to this little island in the Mediterranean. And it works for a little bit. But in March of 1815, Napoleon hatches a plot. He sneaks back into France. He's got a whole bunch of people all set up in networks that are going to rise up to support him. He calls on his former soldiers to rally to his side, and he puts together this huge army on a moment's notice and starts marching towards Paris. And of course, Napoleon's reputation is so fantastic. Louis XVIII, who has virtually no military experience, he just runs. He just takes off and runs. So Napoleon marches up to Paris, and he proclaims himself emperor once again, and he takes over, and he's raising an army because he knows the British and the Prussians, etc., are going to try to stop him. So the British and the Prussians agree they're going to try to attack Napoleon. Napoleon marches out to meet him, and they meet at a place called Waterloo. And for the first time, really, Waterloo is a pitched set-piece battle, French against the English at first, and then the Prussians show up late in the day, and Napoleon gets beaten. So he loses at Waterloo. And the British win. And Napoleon, just to sort of finish his story, Napoleon then gets exiled to St. Helena, which is in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and he would live there until about 1825. He died from poisoning. Some people think the British poisoned him. Some recent analyses show that he was using a hair tonic that had a lot of lead in it, and he might have been giving himself lead poisoning, but in any case, he died in about 1825. Don't quote me on the date. Overall, though, if you look at, the Napoleonic Wars were the biggest wars in history up to that point. If you look at the total number of men that Napoleon mobilized in his armies, between 1800 and 1812, when he was emperor, basically, first consul and then for life and then emperor, he mobilized 1.3 million men in his armies. And then between 1813 and 1814, when he came back for the 100 Days, he mobilized another 1 million men. This is an enormous mobilization of military manpower. The world has never seen anything like this. And the Russians and the Austrians and the Prussians and the British are all mobilizing similar numbers, right? And so this is, and some historians have argued that this is really the first total war, that this is the entire economy and population of France fighting against the entire economy and population of Austria, Prussia, Russia, etc. But now, okay, so Napoleon is finally defeated, okay, and he's finally done, and we know he's done, right? So now, the post-revolutionary, what do, right? Essentially, Britain, Prussia, Austria, they now control France. And they can do whatever they want to. They can undo, and they want to undo the French Revolution because they really don't like all the things the French Revolution has unleashed. And there are a bunch of things that are really, really destabilizing. Right now, I want to point out several things. Number one, at this point, 1815, the Industrial Revolution is beginning. Right, it started in the late 1780s in England. And by 1815, it's really spreading to Holland, to England, etc. And it's going slowly. The first countries like England to industrialize, it took a long time for them to industrialize. It really is only in the 1850s that they finished industrializing. But as industrialization spreads, it's going to cause massive shifts in Europe's population. You're going to see cities explode. You're going to see manufacturing explode. You're going to go from economies that are based on agriculture, with most people as peasants, to economies that are based on industrial production, and most people live in cities, right? That's going to happen over the next century, century and a half. But it's going to start. So, and there's no way they can stop that from happening. But in the meantime, they do see, the Allies, they see that there are some real things that got unleashed. And number one is that during the French Revolution, the soldiers of France, the soldiers fighting behind Napoleon, were often not motivated by loyalty to a monarch. They were motivated by a loyalty to France, right? The armies that had marched out from Paris, right after the September massacres, were mobilized they wanted to save the revolution in France. They weren't loyal to any particular house or person or anything like that. They were fighting for France. And so, because they had gotten rid of the monarchy, and they had, the revolution had created this new idea that you could be loyal to your country. And this was a new idea, and this was really a strange idea, because before this, people, the average person defined themselves mostly in terms of what village or town they were from, what region they were from. Each little region, there was not that much travel, so each little region had its own character. Often in France, each region had its own little dialect. They had their regional styles of clothing and food and whatever. And so your region was sort of who you were, right? Much the same way that, maybe Texans think of themselves as Texans rather, is more important to their identity than maybe being American, although that's not exactly a good comparison. But if there was a sense of the nation, it was that Louis XVI, as the King of France, every person in France had a loyalty to Louis XVI. They were his subject. And so if somebody in Marseille, France in the south had something in common with somebody from Rennes in the northwest, it was that they were both subjects of Louis XVI. It wasn't that they spoke the same language. They had different dialects, they had different clothing, they had different food, but they were all subjects of Louis XVI. So before the Napoleonic Wars, people tended to think of themselves in terms of their region, in terms of their family, what family they're from, and then ultimately maybe in terms of being subject to Louis XVI. But during the Revolution, they had created this new identity of being French, right? And being French now meant something, right? They had fought in the Napoleonic Wars for decades, 25 years of warfare, for being French with different governments, but each government was a republic and there was no king. So what are you fighting for? They had forged this new identity called Frenchness, right? And ultimately we'll see that nationalism emerges as a sense of a shared culture, a shared language, a shared history. We'll see those things emerge as nationalism, but it's first begun here. And when the leaders of Britain and Prussia and Austria got together to say, what do we do with France? They realized they had a problem with nationalism, that they didn't like it, right? The aristocratic classes before this, they didn't want all the people in France to think of themselves as French. They wanted the people in this region to think of themselves as subjects of the Duke of whatever, and they wanted people in that region to think of themselves as subjects of the Count of whatever, and they wanted them to think of having a relationship with the aristocracy, not with each other. And nationalism, by its very nature, and this was something the French Revolution consciously cultivated, nationalism says that everybody in a nation is somehow equal, right? Think of the French Revolutionary motto: liberté, liberty, égalité, equality, fraternité, brotherhood. Equality and brotherhood. And the old aristocratic order, was about everybody thinking the aristocrats were better than the peasants, and the middle class was supposed to have different gradations. Everyone was supposed to have their place in the social system. You weren't supposed to think you were equal and in brotherhood with anybody else, right? And so this is a real problem. Well, the Allies, the conquering powers, Britain, Prussia, Russia, Austria, they get together at Vienna in 1815 to decide what the heck they're going to do, right? And they basically decide that what they're going to try to do is to put back in the box the whole French Revolution, right? The French Revolution had unleashed all these forces and all these new ideas and all these new discourses and all this class conflict. And they basically wanted to put it all back. They wanted to go back to the order before the French Revolution, where there had been a clear social hierarchy with aristocrats being born into privilege and wealth and having control of agricultural production, and the peasants working on the land and basically producing the wealth for the aristocrats, and the cities being fairly small and easily controlled, and they wanted absolute monarchy, and they wanted secure control of everything in the government by the aristocracy. They did not want a bourgeoisie that thought they could run things, right? So they really wanted to undo all this. Well, on the one level, they could undo it in the sense that at the sort of level of nations drawing a map of Europe, they could say, okay, let's go back, right? And so they do. I mean, obviously all of Napoleon's brothers got thrown out of all those monarchies. And so they basically say, well, we'll go back and we'll put together the nations that existed before. So France will go back to its borders, 1789. Prussia and Austria will get their territories back, and Italy will be under the Austrians, etc. But there's some difficulties percolating here, because over the course of the 25 years, the power relationships in Europe had changed. France had really become much more powerful because France, during the Revolution, had learned how to mobilize the nation in terms of nationalism. And that made France, I mean, the fact that Napoleon could pull up 1.3 million soldiers in no time, that's just something none of the aristocratic monarchies could have done before, right? But Napoleon could draw on nationalism and get people excited. And so, in France, they knew how to mobilize. France is a big country, and now France really knew how to capitalize on that for military success. And so what do we do with this, right? And England had also actually become more powerful during the Napoleonic Wars, in part because England had developed its navy considerably, but England had also for a long time, throughout the last half of the 1700s, been building a colonial empire. And England was much more powerful than people had thought before, right? Other countries had really been battered badly. I mean, Russia and Austria were really weakened dramatically by the Napoleonic Wars. Austria in particular, I mean, the Holy Roman Empire that Napoleon had dismantled had been really weak. It was a conglomeration of all these different territories that had no real coherency beyond the fact that there was a Holy Roman Emperor, and he was really weak. And so the Holy Roman Empire had really just sort of fallen apart. And the Austrian and Hungarian monarchies were still, they were pretty badly battered also. Now we'll see they'll hang on for another 100 years and finally get destroyed in World War I. But this meeting at Vienna, the Congress at Vienna, really starts to expose the fact that, everybody says they want to go back, but England has some ideas about how they're going to be players now, because they've really organized the anti-Napoleon coalition, and they've really become more powerful. And countries like Spain, which just got destroyed by Napoleon and lost, losing all of its colonies, Spain's going to be crippled and become a really minor player now. And what about Italy? And so what ultimately happens is that Russia becomes a little more powerful, although it's still a really backwards country in terms of trade and stuff. Russia still has serfdom. Austria would lose a lot. They would basically lose control of big chunks of Italy, and then what they did hold on to in Italy, they held on to kind of tentatively, because really the Italians are starting to realize that they don't need to be under the Austrians that much anymore. And France held on to some territories in Italy, but basically the whole idea here is that they were gonna restore all the old monarchies as best they could. So, Spain, the monarchy got toppled. They bring back the Spanish king. Little territories in Italy. The Kingdom of Sardinia, Piedmont, and Sardinia. They bring back the king. They bring back the the Prussians and etc. And so they basically try to restore this, and they turn to Louis XVIII, and they say, "You are now the king of France." And they basically decide, and Louis XVIII decides he's going to try to bring back as much as he can of the pre-1789. He's going to bring back noble titles, and he's going to try to bring back the whole shebang of the feudal system with seigneurial rights and everything. He quickly finds out that the French are just not going to take that anymore because that had all been abolished during the Revolution. It had been gone for 25 years now. So he finds that he can't really bring that back, but he can come back and say, I'm an absolute monarch like I was before. I can write whatever laws I want to. I have absolute power. And nobody can stop him from that because France has been defeated and there's nobody who's going to march against him. So what comes out of Vienna, they try to come up with a system whereby everybody's afraid of France now, right? They're just terrified of France because, France had fought the rest of Europe for like 15 years at least, 25 years, and they had won almost. And so everybody's afraid of France. And so what basically comes out of Vienna is a sort of an alliance of different countries. They strengthen some of the countries like Prussia, and try to strengthen Austria in order to create an alliance of nations that could fight back against France in the future. And they try to sort of isolate France so that France is sort of alone against the rest of Europe if it tries anything in the future. But really, the biggest problem is that the French Revolution had unleashed forces, right? The French Revolution had given political power to the bourgeoisie. All those doctors and lawyers in France who had been in the National Assembly and the Constitutional Convention and the Legislative Assembly, etc., had felt like they were now brought into politics, and they felt like they had a right to have opinions about politics. They had a right to have their voice heard in politics. And even though Napoleon had set up an absolute monarchy, he had listened, and he had his plebiscites and things. So he had made it clear that he thought his power came from the people of France, and he sort of represented the people of France. That was a different idea than what had been before the French Revolution, where kings thought that they had gotten their power from God and the church, and it didn't matter what the people thought. This is how it was going to be. Well, there's no putting that back in the box after the French Revolution. And Napoleon had conquered everywhere. And he had changed the laws in Germany and in Italy and in Spain, and he had thrown out all these old laws and all these old privileges and all these old seigneurial systems, etc. And so there really was no putting that back in the box. And so, but one of the things we'll see is, this post-revolutionary order basically puts aristocrats back in charge, right? It puts the old dynastic monarchies back in power, and it puts aristocrats back in charge, but the French Revolution has awakened the middle class, and it's even awakened the lower classes in a lot of cases. And what we're going to see over the next century, from 1815 until World War I, is that there's going to be a whole slew of changes in Europe. There's going to be this enormous convulsion in Europe. Part of this is going to be caused by the Industrial Revolution, right? The Industrial Revolution is going to transform the economies of European countries from being based on agriculture primarily to being based on industry primarily. Europeans are going to conquer all these colonies across the world. They're going to conquer most of Africa and big chunks of Asia, and they're going to dominate South America. And that's going to bring enormous wealth into Europe. and all sorts of raw materials and things into Europe. And Europeans are going to largely move off of the agriculture. Subsistence farming is going to go down and down and down. It's going to be replaced by commercial farming, where people are producing mostly, using more and more machinery and scientific advances in fertilizers, etc. And they're going to be producing more and more food per acre and selling it. And the majority of the population is going to wind up moving into cities. Europe wouldn't pass 50% of cities until, I think it's after World War I even. But the trend is, for the next 100 years, people are moving into cities, and cities are growing and growing. And more of the population is involved in working in factories or businesses in cities, and less of the population is peasants on farms. And so, and the bourgeoisie, the middle classes, are going to explode in the 19th century because they really get enormous amounts of wealth and prestige and power from the Industrial Revolution, right? Because it's the bourgeoisie, it's not the aristocrats, it's the bourgeoisie who is setting up new businesses and factories, and they're running them, and they're getting wealthy on that. And the people who are becoming wealthy are usually middle class, they're not aristocrats. And so this bourgeoisie this urban bourgeoisie is going to become wealthier and wealthier, and they're going to demand political power, right? After the French Revolution, they had a sense that we should have political power. We can run things. We know how. The sort of mystique of the aristocrats had been destroyed. So this rising middle class over the course of the 19th century would demand more and more political power, and you would see multiple revolutions. France has a revolution in 1830, 1848, 1870, and France would ultimately wind up with a republic. Right? At several points, right? The First Republic was in the French Revolution. We've talked about that. The Second Republic would be founded in 1848, and then the Third Republic would be founded in 1870. And so France would gradually see this shift. The aristocracy, they're back at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, but they're just going to lose power again, right? Over the course of the 19th century. And you're going to see more and more people brought into politics. Every country, England has voting, it's constitutional monarchy, they expand the franchise over the course of the 19th century, right? They're expanding it to virtually all men, and then eventually after World War I to women also. New countries like France would usually have a pretty reduced franchise, meaning you had to have a certain amount of money to vote, but that would gradually expand until they have universal male suffrage in France. And so not the Napoleonic Wars, but the French Revolution as a whole, they try to put it back in the box, but the box is open. You can't put that stuff back. The conflict between the bourgeoisie and the aristocracy is going to go on throughout the 19th century. The bourgeoisie would win, right? And the transformations of the economy that you would see beginning, tentatively during the French Revolution would just explode and transform Europe in the Industrial Revolution. And the ideas of nationalism and the sort of discarding of the old aristocratic social hierarchies and the spreading sort of atheism, or the diminished importance of religion, society's just changing, right? It's changing. And the French Revolution, in some ways, had pointed the direction. It said, here's a preview of what's coming. It's like a movie trailer. Here in 25 years is what's coming. And then over the next century, it would actually spread and transform Europe. And if you think about where Europe was in 1789, and you compare it to Europe in 1889 or on the eve of World War I, it's just it's not even the same continent, right? Because industrialization and nationalism and the spread of political revolutions and political rights has just transformed Europe. All right, so we're going to end here with the sort of restoration, it's called, of the old regime. Louis XVIII is king of France, and they've restored everything with the Congress of Vienna. But it's the tensions are still there. The energy that had sparked the French Revolution was still there. And over the next 100 years, the French Revolution will simply keep coming back, right? And you'll see revolutions all across Europe. And so ultimately the French Revolution seems to be done in 1815, but it had started a process that would continue on until the 20th century and really would transform all of European society. So this is the second to last lecture. On Thursday, I'll do the last lecture for this course, and there I'm going to talk about politically the legacy of the French Revolution, because the French Revolution had created all these new ideologies and new political positions, and we'd seen all this ideological conflict in the National Assembly. We'd seen that the sans-culottes had their agenda, and the middle class had their agenda, and the aristocrats had their agenda. This gives rise, over the course of the next century, to a political spectrum. And the political ideologies that we think of today, socialism, communism, liberalism, conservatism, even fascism and such, those ideologies were started basically during the French Revolution. They can trace their roots to the French Revolution. So next time I'm just going to look a little bit ahead and say, here's where the ideologies coming out of the French Revolution would grow into.